official report says hypothermia. The evidence says otherwise. Radiation traces, missing organs, and a death pattern that matches Dyatlov Pass exactly. The terrifying connections between these cases will keep you awake tonight. Under the icy breath of eastern Siberia, in a land where ancient mountains loom like sentinels over the desolate earth, Lyudmila Korovina, a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, led 6 students into the wilderness. Her name was whispered with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Feared by colleagues who thought her methods were extreme, beloved by pupils who saw her as a guardian of the wild. Her philosophy was carved in stone. Pain was temporary, weakness was a state of mind, and survival was a craft only the relentless could master. That summer of 1993, she took her protégés, each of them seasoned, some barely past adolescence, on an expedition through the Hamardaban Ridge, an expanse so remote and ruthless that its silence could unhinge the mind. Among the students was Sasha, a 23-year-old man of towering strength and quiet loyalty. Though not her biological son, Lyudmila called him her own. Then came Tatiana, poised at 24, followed by 19-year-old Denis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and the youngest at 17, Valentina Yudachenko. They were a formation of youth and willpower, forged in cold weather drills and countless treks. But none of them could have foreseen the horror waiting at the summit of the Hamardaban. Their journey began with the rhythmic pulse of steel wheels. A Trans-Siberian train took them from Kazakhstan into the mountainous borderlands of Siberia, terminating at a quaint outpost called Marino, where the land sloped toward the abyss of Lake Baikal. There, beside the deepest lake in Russia, Lyudmila charted their path, northward, across desolate terrain of stones and coarse grass, toward the ridge, where other hiking groups, including one led by her own daughter, would eventually converge. The air was calm, the forecasts favorable, and morale unwavering as they ascended, unaware that the winds above would tear their sanity to pieces. For the first day, the group advanced steadily. Laughter echoed across valleys, meals were modest but warm, and the students trusted in their instructor's poise. But as they rose past the tree line, the heavens shifted. Snow began to fall, thin needles that grew into torrents. The winds howled with feral rage, dragging with them sheets of icy rain and driving temperatures into the marrow of their bones. What had been forecast as clear and warm morphed into a violent parody of summer. Still, Lyudmila pressed on. She had battled far worse, and her creed remained the same. Forward, always forward. 3 days into the trek, on the evening of August 4th, they found themselves mere minutes from the summit. But the conditions had grown apocalyptic. The forest behind them had vanished into the storm. The slope ahead was a sheer wall of screaming wind, and the mountain no longer welcomed them. Against all logic, Lyudmila called for a stop. She ordered them to pitch camp directly on the bald face of the mountain, with no trees, no natural cover, and no safety from the onslaught. They laid down their stakes into frozen earth, set up 2 tattered tents, and curled up in soaked sleeping bags, barely warm enough to outpace the cold creeping into their lungs. That night became a battlefield. Wind ripped the ropes from the tents, water drenched the interiors, and when they tried to sleep, the freezing air gnawed at their flesh. At 4 a.m., their tent was nearly lifted into the air. It wasn't sleep that claimed them that night, but something closer to unconscious resilience. When dawn came, Lyudmila saw death circling like a hawk. Everything was encased in ice. She made the decision. They had to descend immediately. Firewood and warmth waited in the forest below, and she intended to reach it before death did. But fate had already pulled the pin. As they began their descent on the morning of August 5th, Sasha, the strongest among them, collapsed. At first, they thought it was a misstep, but when he rose, staggered, then collapsed again, panic overtook curiosity. Blood gushed from his nose, ears, and mouth. His eyes, once steadfast and certain, brimmed with primal terror before going dim. He died in Lyudmila's arms. She screamed. The others froze, staring at a corpse that had, just moments earlier, been invincible. What followed was chaos dipped in acid. Lyudmila wailed and refused to leave Sasha's side. She ordered the students to continue down into the forest to save themselves, but they hesitated. Moments later, she called them back. Bleeding herself now, eyes wide with unspoken dread, her collapse was sudden and final. Then the others began to fall like dominoes struck by a spectral hand. Victoria and Tatiana shrieked as their bodies spasmed. They tore their clothes off in madness, scraping at their throats as though invisible hands choked them. Victoria curled into a fetal position, died with blood between her teeth. Tatiana bashed her skull against a stone again and again until stillness replaced agony. Timur dropped next. Then Dennis staggered behind a rock, clutching his sides, coughing blood but still conscious enough to whisper his final instructions to Valentina. "Grab your sleeping bag. Flee." And flee she did, but not before looking down and seeing the boy's blood bubbling from his nose as he slumped dead over his backpack. Valentina Yudachenko, caked in snow and fear, ran, her mind frayed at the edges, her heart racing with the trauma of 6 bodies collapsing like puppets with their strings cut. She reached the forest and found shelter beneath a rock outcrop. There she stayed for days, drifting between sleep and waking nightmares. The storm tore branches around her, and she lay still, certain the mountain would swallow her like it had the others. On the 4th day, her ghost-like form wandered back toward the river. There, Ukrainian kayakers, slicing through the silence of the Siberian wilderness, caught sight of something terrible. Valentina standing at the tree line, her face blank, her clothes stained crimson. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Not at first. They wrapped her in blankets, brought her to town, and finally, when words returned, they unlocked a tale that authorities would struggle to believe. A search party was dispatched. A month later, the bodies were found on the mountain where Valentina had left them. The scene was grotesque, their faces contorted in expressions of indescribable torment, mouths frozen mid-scream. Their shoes and clothing were missing. Their eyeballs were gone. Theories bloomed like frost across the landscape. Was it hypothermia, as the autopsy tried to conclude? That didn't explain the blood. That didn't explain the terror etched into every lifeless face. The official cause of death was declared to be hypothermia with contributing protein deficiency and bruising of the lungs. But none of these explanations reconciled what Valentina had seen with her own eyes. Death had not crept in slowly. It had struck like lightning, sudden, inexplicable, and merciless. And why had she survived? No one could answer. The incident was buried under paperwork and sealed files. But for those who knew the mountain, who had walked its cruel ridges, there were whispers of another event, older, eerily similar. The Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959. 9 hikers, experienced, vanished into myth after a blizzard drove them to make camp on an exposed slope. One night, they sliced open their tent from the inside and ran barefoot into sub-zero snow. Some were found at a makeshift fire, others frozen mid-step. 2 were discovered in a den, their bodies crushed. 1 woman had no tongue. Several showed traces of radiation. Official cause of death, an unknown compelling force. Decades later, officials blamed an avalanche. Experts pushed back. No such avalanche had ever been recorded in that region. And now, with the Hamar Dabin deaths echoing those of Dyatlov, the shadows deepened. Was there a pattern, a phenomenon, a weapon? Was something ancient and malevolent buried in Russia's forgotten peaks? Ludmila Korovina's legacy, once a symbol of strength, transformed into a cautionary ghost story. Her students, young, vibrant, full of ambition, became nameless statistics in a file marked accident. But Valentina's eyes never forgot. She had seen the face of something humans weren't meant to understand. And it stood atop the Hamar Dabin, cloaked in storm and silence, watching them climb, waiting for them to fall. There are places on this earth where logic dissolves, where the wilderness doesn't just test you, it judges you. And when it decides you don't belong, no map, no compass, no skill or training will save you. Only silence remains. And in that silence, the mountain remembers. So tell us, do you believe what happened was just hypothermia? Or something far more disturbing? Was it nature's fury, or a force that science still cannot name? Why did only Valentina survive? And what truth lies buried with the others? We want to hear your theories in the comments. And if this story left you haunted, subscribe. Because some mountains don't just test your strength, they decide your fate.